Good evening and welcome. My name is Andrew Westover, the Eleanor McDonald Storza Director of Education here at the High Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us. You may have noticed the yellow letters projected on the screen behind me. This is a live captioning service. A person in another room is listening to the sound the microphone picks up, then transcribing that sound into text. Now, should the captioner incorrectly type a word or phrase during this program, I encourage you to lend them some grace, and I hope you find the service useful. A special thank you to High Museum members in attendance. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. This program, of course, is in conjunction with the current exhibition, A Long Arc, Photography in the American South since 1845, which was organized by the High Museum of Art, and this exhibition is on view currently until January 14. I know that many of you have already seen the show, but for those of you who haven't yet, and for those of you who would, I'm sure, be inspired to see it again, please do come back to the museum to see this work. The exhibition was made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines, ACT Foundation, William N. Banks Jr., the Cousins Foundation, Burton M. Gold, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Harry Norman Realtors, the Wish Foundation, and Benefactor Exhibition Series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. I'd also like to thank Noah Schmitz, Yadira Padilla, Aaron Dougherty, John Voorhees, and the full High team for their essential support making this program happen. A special note for tonight's conversation: there will be a limited number of copies of the Long Arc exhibition catalog available for purchase directly outside this building following the conversation, should you be so inspired. And now I will share brief biographical information about this evening's speakers. Rahim Fortune is a photographer who lives and works between Austin, Texas, and Brooklyn, New York. Focusing on the narratives of individual families and communities, Fortune explores shifting geographies of migration and resettlement and the way that these histories are written on the landscapes of Texas and the American South. His work has been featured in exhibitions worldwide and is included in collections at several institutions, including, of course, the High Museum of Art, Luma Arles, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Greg Harris is the Donald and Marilyn Keough Family Curator of Photography here at the High. He is a specialist in contemporary photography with a particular interest in documentary practice. Since joining the High in 2016, Harris has curated over a dozen exhibitions, including A Long Arc, Evelyn Hofer, Eyes on the City, and Look Again, 40 Years of Collecting Photographs, as well as solo shows with Thomas Struth, Paul Graham, and Amy Elkins. He has also contributed essays to monographs by Matthew Brandt, Paul D'Amato, Amy Elkins, Jill Frank, and the Metabolic Studio. He holds a BFA in photography from Columbia College, Chicago, and an MA in art history from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Now, without further ado, I invite you to join me in welcoming to our stage Rahim Fortune and Greg Harris.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for coming tonight. I also want to make sure that we thank our friends from UGA who helped us bring Rahim down here. Rahim spent the last few days in Athens engaging with students and giving a talk there. So thank you to the University of Georgia. Hopefully this is a new partnership that will keep going places. So Rahim, thanks for coming down. Happy to have you here. I'm going to give a quick overview of A Long Arc. Just to provide a little bit of context for the conversation. Rahim's kind of in a unique position here in that he is a photographer and artist who is in the exhibition and his work is in the book, but Rahim also wrote an essay for the exhibition catalog. So he has kind of a dual role here. So we're kind of going to be talking about the show and about Rahim's work. So A Long Arc is the first major survey in over 25 years to look at the history of photography in the region. And the exhibition examines the way that photographers from the mid-19th century to the present have articulated the distinctive and evolving character of the South's people, landscape, and culture, and reckoned with the region's fraught history. What we really wanted to do with the show is try to retell the history of American photography with the South at the center of that story rather than as kind of a peripheral place within that narrative. There's over 180 photographs in the exhibition, 2/3 of which are from the High's permanent collection. There's many recent acquisitions that are featured in the exhibition, and it spans virtually the entire history of photography. So it starts kind of in the antebellum and Civil War period, and the South really has shaped the medium of photography in really important ways. So if you look at kind of these notable crisis points, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, the present moment that we're living in, the South is kind of critical to the history of the country, but also these major shifts in the history of photography. So beginning with the Civil War, this is the first major conflict to be photographed. And on the one hand, there were ways that photographs were used in these very personal ways as these objects of mourning and memory, as people were getting portraits made of themselves to send home to family members. And as around 600,000 people were killed in the conflict, these were important objects in the process of mourning this conflict, this national conflict. But then also, it was the first major conflict to be documented in photographs, and so it became a way for the country to kind of take stock of the trauma that had happened to the country. This portion of the show also places a particular emphasis on the role that recently emancipated Black Americans played in their own emancipation during the Civil War. So there's a suite of photographs here of a Black artillery unit, and this is kind of a known part of the history of the war and of photography, but it's something that really is focused on in the exhibition. Jumping ahead quite a bit. The Great Depression was really a major moment in the history of photography and also in the South. And so at this time, there were photographers who were sent to the South by the federal government under the auspices of the Farm Security Administration to make images that made a case for why the government needed to intervene in the lives of the rural poor and really help create programs that would enrich their lives and create kind of an economic base for these people. And some of the most important photographers of the early 20th century, people like Walker Evans, Margaret Burke White, Dorothea Lange, came to the South to make pictures. And in the process, they kind of invented the language of documentary photography as we've come to know it, this very stripped down, direct way of making pictures. And it was a kind of a style that dominated photography for decades following. A lot of these photographers, none of whom were from the South, by the way, were enamored with the vernacular character of the South and this kind of agrarian culture that was kind of idealized and held a great degree of nostalgia as the country was really shifting to more of an urban country. Of course, the Civil Rights Movement is a really critical moment in the history of photography and is really important to the High's collection of photography. So you're probably more familiar with pictures that document protests and other kinds of civic actions. And those are really critical pictures to that history, but one of the key moments in the exhibition looks at the work of Doris Derby, who is actually an Atlanta-based photographer who spent a lot of time in Mississippi working on grassroots organizing, and photographed all of these activities along the way. So she photographed voter registration drives, farming co-ops, craft co-ops, and really was invested in building an economic base for the rural Black poor in the South. And she brings a really important, very intimate perspective of a Black woman to the Civil Rights Movement that is often untold in a lot of the pictures that we see of the Civil Rights Movement. Moving ahead, following the tumult of the 1960s, a lot of photographers really kind of turned inward and looked at things that were much more personal to themselves, their family, the kind of like local environs around them. It's also a moment where color is introduced into the language of fine art photography. So people like William Eggleston and William Christenberry were instrumental in bringing color in as an expressive tool into photography. And people like Eggleston were really keen on taking these moments out of the everyday and making them kind of fantastical, and color was really essential to that. And then jumping ahead to kind of the present moment. So right now, there's a lot of photographers who are working here making really incredible work that really examines how the South is a particularly dynamic place and how the identity of the South and kind of what it means to be Southern is really up for grabs. And people are kind of throwing their hat in the ring to say, like, this is what it means to be Southern. And the demographics are changing. So people are really trying to write a new narrative of what it means to be Southern. And kind of two people that we focus on in the exhibition. And this is the big part of the show. This kind of last 25 years of the show is one of the real critical moments of the exhibition. Two of those photographers are Jose Ibarra Rizzo, who lives here in Atlanta, and Tommy Keough. So Jose's work is about the Mexican-American community here in Atlanta, and they're really tender photographs that focus on a community that is either not often represented or maligned in popular media. And so this picture of this couple embracing and emphasizes this intimacy and care in the picture and a real personal connection in the photograph. And then Tommy Keough, this really incredible image, which has become kind of an infamous image in recent dialogues around contemporary photography. Tommy's the child of Vietnamese and Chinese Americans, and he is really masterful at using humor to kind of unpack the ways that people are othered in contemporary culture. So it's a surreal self-portrait of sorts that includes this cardboard cutout of him dressed up as Elvis. And Tommy is reappropriating the image of Southern masculinity and sex appeal and kind of turning it on its head and asking questions about who gets to tell the stories about the South, who gets to say this is what it means to be Southern, this is what it means to be American in this moment. So a lot of these photographers are asking a lot of questions and kind of challenging us to rethink our kind of assumed ideas about the South. So with that, thank you, that was really, really, really fast.
You did great.
I'm getting a little warm up here. Could we switch over to the next slideshow when you have a second? And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take my jacket off.
Go for it.
So as I mentioned, Rahim contributed an essay to the catalog, and I'm really kind of envious of Rahim because Rahim is a fantastic writer and a great photographer, and it really kind of pisses me off when there's that much talent in different areas kind of concentrated in one person. So anyway, we're not here to talk about that. But so in your essay, you talk about the duality of the South, and I'm gonna quote you back to yourself here. So you say, life, especially in the South, is often both and, love and heartbreak, birth and grief, struggle and celebration. Can you talk about how you see that contradiction in the region? I mean, you grew up in the South, and so it's something that is really close to you.
Yeah, so just quickly again, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's really cool to see everybody here and to get this much love in Atlanta. It means a lot. And also to the High Museum, who's, since working with them has always been a great institution, who's really been connected and relevant with the community. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But yeah, so I grew up between Texas and Oklahoma, and I always kind of talk about Oklahoma in context of like something like Route 66 was actually considered when you got to Oklahoma, you were now in the American West. But very politically was the South. It was a place that had slavery, fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, as well as had segregation, Jim Crow. And you'll have similar arguments about Texas. Some people actually don't consider Texas the South, and it is more kind of the imagination of Texas is the western part of it, and the Marlboro Man-esque cowboy. But there's actually 5 geographic and kind of temporal regions in Texas, so there's almost every type of environment in Texas, and there's kind of a boundless imagination, but a lot of that is kind of encapsulated within this kind of iconography of the Western expansion and the kind of domination of Native and African Americans. So yeah, so as you talk about the duality, I mean, it's something that's very present within the South, and I kind of see it within multiple institutions and places. I think about an art form like blues and how that is also intrinsically connected to country music and folk music, and there's this kind of constant kind of conversation between light and darkness, this like idea of moving on. And I also have photographed heavily in Southern churches, and there's this kind of idea also that's within the church, and that's connected to social movements in the South as well, where you kind of have each high and low, and I always have been really interested in that idea, is how you could feel so, the up moments of the music and the connection between generations, but then there's also the moment of asking for prayer for some person who's, going through this kind of unimaginable circumstance. And I think that those things really characterize the South as I know it, and I think that there's endless ways of other people knowing it, and I think that that's the beauty of it and kind of what you're getting at with the show. So yeah.
Also, just to provide a little context, so we asked Rahim to write about his own experience as a photographer growing up in the South and working in the South, and then also to talk a little bit about a couple of photographers that were important to him. So the pictures that are playing behind us right now are by Early Hudnall and Ramel Ross. This is Ramel's work right now, and then Rahim's work, and these are just going to keep cycling behind us. But just so you know, not all of these pictures are by Rahim. I think that these ideas like stereotypes and myths are something that's really important, and it's something that we try to grapple with in the show. So you grew up in the South, and as you were learning about photography and you continue to make photographs here, what are some of the abiding myths or stereotypes that have stood out for you, and where did they come from? Like, how did you come to learn those myths and those stereotypes?
Yeah. I was really interested in the essay in particular at kind of unpacking the kind of history of images as we saw them in the South. And one thing that really stuck out to me was this kind of like readily availableness of the South as a subject matter for artists. It was kind of I was looking at this period that was post-civil rights, post-Vietnam, where there's a lot of social activism and this kind of real, a cause that really was riling people up to get out and to make images. And after, there's a generation post-civil rights who grew up looking at Danny Lyons images, who don't necessarily have the same things at stake to go and photograph. So a lot of them turn to coming to the South, and you start to see this kind of beginning of this imposed lyrical quality that's kind of being imposed on the South by these black and white photographers, mostly from coastal cities coming in. And the moment that we're learning about the South, because those are often the only kind of moments that we have, are like this, because the thing I always say about like, black folks and native folks is like the most very open communities, very like embracing, and how that can be taken advantage of by photographers. And I felt like there was a little bit of that happening that I was seeing in the archive, where the only moments we have of these community is when the outsider kind of arrives with the camera in this kind of joyous moment. And so there's a lot of moments that are also written out of that. And I always go back to the LaToya Frazier quote, because she's one of my like biggest inspirations. She talks about like, I want to see the photo that the migrant mother in Dorothea Lange's picture would have made, and that's where my work kind of settles in. So we could go on and on about stereotypes and tropes, but that's kind of the root of kind of how I view it, is this, how much of our imagination is imposed by outside viewpoint, and then how much of that is not necessarily problematic, but then how do we grapple with that? How do we make something from our own voice in the modern time? I think that, nothing's off limits. It's just like, we're gonna keep it real with you if it's good or bad.
So I want to come back to that insider-outsider dichotomy, but I also want to talk about the history of photography. And you've already started doing it, but one of the things that's really great about talking with Rahim about photography is that he's very, very steeped in the history of photography. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted you to write for the catalog, is because, not only are you a great photographer, but you've really thought a lot about the photographers who have come before you. You've absorbed a lot of those images. So could you talk about the role that history plays in your own practice as a photographer?
Yeah, so I began looking at a lot of archives in Texas and Oklahoma, mostly to kind of fill in these gaps within understanding how the places got to where they were, because there's a lot of question marks when the history is not necessarily preserved or readily available for you to go view. There were so many schools and institutions that were closed down, and with the kind of rapid way in which integration happened, a lot of these things that we see within the archive, they seem less tangible to us, and it's almost a bit trivialized at times of understanding the history in a linear manner. So I would look at these archives, in particular in a place like Oklahoma, where I grew up, and kind of had this difficult relationship with it. And it was the first work that I made was in Oklahoma, and that was kind of the precursor to the work that's showing now. So photo history, I guess, is one sense of looking at it, but also vernacular photographs, local newspaper photographers, they were also capturing these like critical moments that were just for me like filling in a blank of how I could understand how I got there, my own positionality within the world. And so that was a very influential thing. And then also stylistically, looking at these images, starting to understand, because my first interest was in seeing something like the new topographics, and there's like people that were making these kind of really interesting prints of these devoid landscapes, and I'm like, well, if you've ever been to Oklahoma, like that's kind of what it looks like, open field, maybe one kind of abandoned building, which is like a very big indicator of someone like Robert Adams or Frank Golke, is like these open tonal scenes. And I was like, oh wow, that looks like Oklahoma. So when I went back there, I'm kind of like learning in reverse. I'm like, okay, so like I know they kind of shoot this way, and was like, not to say naive, but I wasn't coming from the most like a scholarly background. And so it also served as like a guidebook, and it's interesting, and I think that also is maybe a testament of having access to the internet, because I could imagine before, like those images were maybe more cloaked, or the only photo book you saw was like a Diane Arbus Aperture book, or, what's another like iconic one that most people got their hands on? Oh, The Americans. So, that's a kind of just very particular viewpoint. But that has good things and bad things. I often think that sometimes maybe the reference point within contemporary photography has shrunken because there's so many things that aren't on the internet. But yeah, that's kind of my relationship with photo history, and something I'm always trying to stay interested and inspired and challenged. And just when you think you've got it all figured out, you come to a show like Gregory curated, and you realize there's so much more to learn.
I also like in your essay how you talk about one of your first encounters with photographs was in a family album. And I think that's an experience that we can all relate to, but we don't all go on to become photographers necessarily. So like, can you talk a little bit about that, and like what did you see in your own family photographs, or even in other people's family photographs, that informed how you make pictures yourself?
Yes, I mean, in the essay, I talk about this idea of like growing up in the South, and a lot of times the main thing to do, especially like in a small town where I live, is like we just go thrifting or antiquing. Like that's just like the event for the day. And it's like that drive, you might see so nice clouds today, or like, oh, nice clouds, and there's a pond, and like that is kind of how my landscape images result. And so when I talked about the antique stores, was how there's always these beautiful photographs that are more or less discarded, and you kind of pick them up and maybe you flip through them, and that's another way of engaging with images. Similar, not too different than a photo book, and you're seeing these images that at one point were very, very important to this family, capturing some kind of holiday or someone returning from war, and all of these moments, and now they've been discarded. And I'm thinking about the authors of these images, and so it could have been a loving family member with a Browning camera, or it could have been a detached studio artist who made this like kind of masterful photo, and the work is produced very technically, but not for the sake of love or art, but more so like, that's why you're at my studio and not the studio down the street. And so it's like not to overly sentimentalize it. So how like kind of this like relationship between loving and detached, and how that is so steeped into these images that are nonetheless beautiful. Because I think sometimes when we get into the ethics with photography, we stop talking about photographs and we just start talking about like sociology and other like, other practices. Because sometimes, a work, photos function in a very particular way, because you could be like this, very critical person, but how does this image function is the most important part. And if the person was an outsider, but they made this image that reveals some sliver of truth, I think that that's still worth a study in a way. And so I guess also to say that, also the kind of what I consider as like the cultures of the people to me, which are like things like hip hop culture, street fashion, skateboarding, kind of like DIY and underground music are also very connected to my work. It's kind of like the art of the people. And so all of those things also kind of move me towards photography as a medium, because most of those things are visual cultures. You see photographs of concerts, you see photographs of skateboarding, but then the subject matter came from looking at my own family and being interested in kind of showing my story before going out and publishing the work of other communities that I've made. I was interested in kind of this idea of being transparent and visible within the work. So that's why the inclusion of self-portraits and the work about my family was really important to do, because in a way it set my foundation for how I would navigate photographing others, kind of with the same care and love that was used with the community that I grew up within.
So I want to back up a little bit and talk about Early Hudnall and Ramel Ross, because these are two really important photographers in the show and in your essay, and they're really interesting choices. And because on the surface they seem like very different kinds of photographers. Early is much more of kind of a traditional documentarian, and then Ramel's work is kind of has more of a conceptual bent. And so I'm curious, why did you choose to write about the two of them together?
Well, I felt like they both represented in a way like a shift in like interest within the medium. You know, as many times as like a new Friedlander book comes out or like a new Brown Sisters is shown or something, you know, it's like these kind of classic things that are, you know, kind of beaten into us in photography. The interest in Early's work and the interest in Ramel's work were kind of these like swirling things that kind of found each other at these kind of opposite like yin and yang sides, very different. I mean, both made in the South, obviously, both black photographers. But Early's work was not necessarily highly collected or published up until recently. And you know, a story for a lot of black American photographers. And I was really interested also in just this idea of poetic language within black American photography. It's like not at all a new thing. And that was kind of an issue with some of the ways that photography was being written about in like the 2020, which I've now coined the term 2020ism. And just a lot of like, oh, the new thing, changing the way, and like I felt like that went away was kind of a jab at these older photographers who did these things with very little commercial gain and really documented a poetry of the community. You know, someone like a Louis Draper and a Word de Carava, and I feel the same way about Early's work. And so he's creating this work. He hadn't put out a book until he did a show catalog a few years ago, and so it's really this very modest way of working in a community that he's always known. He's only photographed in the Fourth Ward primarily, and he still continues to do it to this day. And Ramel is on the other side of that. He's a new artist, more modern artist working, but he's also, in a way, both utilizing and challenging the language of documentary, because, you know, his portraits are both formal and informal, as you see on the screen. He uses the large camera, but he's not necessarily trying to veil things in timelessness or removing them from time. I mean, the inclusion of the iPhone, there's the use of the large camera, and also in conversation with the film that accompanies the work. You know, it was very fascinating to see how he, you know, was able to describe this place in a way that we've maybe never seen. And I think that sometimes people don't understand his images necessarily, and even if they don't connect in the way that he intended, I feel like they're bold in their attempt, and that's like so interesting to me, like that attempting of something new. And so like I said, I feel like, you know, Early's getting his moment and Ramel is, you know, having his moment kind of simultaneously, and it's this kind of leaning into this work that a primary indicator of it is that it was produced by someone from within the community. And so that was a big thing that really drew me into writing about both of their work as something that kind of indicated this new moment that we're entering with photography, that is like, you know, extremely powerful. And so, yeah, I have immense respect for both of those artists.
So in the context of their work, you talk about this term relationality, and it's really kind of like what your essay hinges around. So what do you mean by that term? Because I don't think most of the people in the room have actually read your essay, because most of the copies of the book are not available for people to have, unfortunately. Sorry. And why is that such an important term for you? And does it have any particular significance to work being made in the South, and kind of how do you see it coming out in Early and Ramel's work?
Yeah, I guess it's the sensibilities and the closeness to the subject matter is something that I'm really, you know, struck by in both of their work. Especially with Early, he photographs a lot of young men in these kind of joyous moments, either like flipping or, you know, playing in water, and it's very much like him reflecting on himself as a child. And I think that you can't really get away from this idea of kind of projecting onto your subject matter because the work is coming from you. I mean, there's the Walker Evans quote where he talks about like, we must realize that a camera is just a tool that takes on the characteristics of the operator. And so, sometimes I see formal portraiture and I'm like, you actually didn't photograph the person, they're just standing there like you, and it's like you really can't escape that yourself is in the images, even down just to the way that you hold yourself. Like, that's why I try not to photograph in a bad mood or because that comes through in the images. And so, relationality, also knowing what to photograph, like within Early Hudnall, the close portrait of the young woman getting her hair braided, and that is just an excellent photo, like in just how conceptualizing that is the picture. He could have shot it wide, and it's like this knowledge of knowing what to shoot. He has these images of older women often kind of veiled a bit in a way from the camera, and it just feels like in a way the subtle respect that also was such a part of like being Southern and like the way we move with our elders. It feels like that's what I mean about like relationality. It's a sensibility of knowing what picture, the Ramel photo where it's the, man holding the young boy upside down. Like there's these things that are indicators versus, someone where it's like, okay, stand here, and it's still a technically well-executed photograph, and the person in the photograph is beautiful, so it works, and it's a successful image, but there's not that same knowledge of interior culture and nuance that I see in, and I mean, I see it in a number of artists, but I think they exemplify it very well.
So this is something that comes up a lot, I think, in the way that people talk about photography in the South, and it's something that we try to touch on in a long arc, and it's like the idea of who gets to define the South and who gets to make images in a particular community. And I think that's kind of what you're touching on with relationality. And one of the things that I was really and Sarah, my co-curator, we were going back and forth on quite a lot in putting together this exhibition is, what's the balance of pictures that are made by people who are from the South and who are kind of photographing their own communities, and the balance of pictures that are made by people who are coming here from somewhere else. So there's this idea of like familiarity and novelty, and there's ways that they lead to interesting pictures, but in different ways, and they kind of both have their pitfalls. And so I'm curious how you think about that, because your own work is very personal, and like when you look at the work of other people, is that something that stands out to you? And do you have kind of qualms with people who are not photographing people who are of their own community?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't like to project too much of that onto work because it feels like a closed-minded way of thinking about it. It's like almost like no rules. As I said earlier, it's like learn the rules and forget them. I think being too strict about that is just limiting in a way that I'm not interested in. I'm challenged to be able to even think something is problematic but good. Like I don't have this very like closed-minded way of thinking about photography necessarily. So nothing's off limits. Like I maybe am interested in the kind of wanderlust of the outsider at some particular stance, but if it's problematic and bad, it's like, well, we're gonna let you know, and if it's good, it's, So that's more or less, I don't think about that too much, but I think that is an important question when it comes into like the co-opting of narrative, which is something that can happen with photography. And again, how I said, the kind of like taking advantage of open communities who are, very accepting of people and kind-spirited, and how that can kind of be manipulated by someone. But I think the best quote, which is kind of a bit of like a heavy swing, but Ramel said in his interview with William Christenberry, with the widow of William Christenberry, he says, if you sent a photographer to Alabama and he said, if you asked a white photographer in Alabama if they would be interested in making a photograph of black folks on their porch, 9 out of 10 of them would say yes. And I'm very impressed that without his whole archive, he never did that. And so I think that kind of gets at this idea of stereotype and like, getting the surface level is still exotic enough for the outside photographer, and like, so there is that more so is my qualm. And then also trope and like, the kind of regurgitation of certain types of work and certain styles and certain narratives is more where I would like take issue with. It's like, okay, another abandoned house, another cowboy hat. But if it's a good abandoned house photo or a good cowboy hat photo, it's also, like I said, again, nothing's off limits.
I mean, I think that the people on the porch could be its own subgenre of Southern photography. There's the kudzu pictures, there's the people on porch pictures. I mean,
there's the book porches.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like pitfalls that you can very easily walk into making pictures.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I'll say is also the international, like people coming from outside the country, which is like the Robert Frank, the Jakob Holt, who are two people who I speak about in the essay. In more recent time, George Giorgio, who made a work titled American Parades. And so I think there's also a fine line where it's like, all right, now don't make fun of us now. Like there's that like distinction where it's like, hold up, like you can't say that, So I guess that's the other side.
Frank made some of the most scathing but also perceptive pictures of America from the perspective of an outsider. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about your work. So the pictures that are cycling through right now are from your first book, I Can't Stand to See You Cry. So can you just give us a kind of an overview of that body of work?
Yeah, so this is a body of work that was published by Loose Joints in 2021, and the work really tracks kind of my coming of age in Texas as an artist. So it's kind of looking at these multiple things that were happening both in my life, but kind of also at a moment that was in a way kind of pivotal for just American society in general, like these years kind of like 2016 through 2021. And so it kind of looks at my own understanding of, kind of personal politics in like a rapidly gentrifying community, and my role as artist and as brother and son and friend. And at the same time, we're dealing with a global health crisis. My father was also ill, so this kind of tracks the end of his life, as well as kind of my reimagining of this town that I grew up in. And so working on that project, it was a lot of looking back. So we went through my entire archive of images in Texas, but I also was making work at that time, which was kind of in the height of the COVID time, and as well as the protest, and as I said, caregiving for my father. So it was kind of like this kind of fever pitch of things that was going on that kind of gave me a heightened like emotional sensibility, where it was like, I don't know. It was the other day we had an eclipse in Texas, I guess that's how I would describe it. It's like you walk outside and it's like, it's different, but it's gonna go away. And like, I don't know that I can go back to my hometown and make these pictures now. It was kind of a hunger that was there. And so yes, it covers 6 years of work, and like I said, it tracks those multiple narratives, and also in a way it's kind of like a noir of where I grew up. It's kind of like my life, the movie, like, everybody can kind of participate in the recreation of this story in a very collaborative sense. Like I'm not veiled in what I'm doing. People are participating in it actively, and kind of excited to be a part of it. So yeah, I am super grateful to have published this book. I really love the publishers who made it, and everybody who has resonated with it, and it's been great.
So one of the things that I think is particularly masterful about this book is how you strike a great balance between processing your own personal loss, the death of your father, but also it seems like it's an exercise in grappling with a larger shared tragedy. So how do you strike the balance between those two? How do you know when you've gone too far in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I think also just like thoughtful editing and collaboration is really important in that. And I guess the other thing that I need to acknowledge as well is the essay that I wrote for The Long Arc was in collaboration with Shakira Smith, who is a PhD from Appalachia. We met working with an artist named Duran Jones, and she's a brilliant PhD, and she helps me to like go from the like coffee-fueled chaos of my like brain to like semi-literary text. So she is a huge collaborator for me. She helps me with grants, and we collaborated closely on this one. So yeah, Shakira Smith, PhD, she's really brilliant. She's a practicing therapist, so it's all in step. But yeah, so to your point, how do you toe the line between sentimentalism and kind of just like, in a way, just like reckless dumping, emotional dumping, And I always like the joke of like making work about your friends or your family. It's like, well, your family's not Larry Sultans, and your friends aren't Nan Goldings. They're not as interesting, Your family's not Emmett Gowans. So there's that line too. It's like, how do you go from like the snapshot to an art photo, from the family album to something that people are interested in and can find an audience? And so that gets back to, speaking about the art history and kind of knowing the knowledge. I always made the joke where it's like when you're working on a book project and you're Googling the number of plates and books that you like, because you're just like, all right, as long as I can get 40, that's how many he did. And then you see a book that's like 200 plates and you're like, oh shit. But like I said, thoughtful editing, working with collaborators from different viewpoints who you trust. I think that sometimes you have to be careful because so much of as an artist, your self-value is wrapped up in your work, and you could show somebody who's like got their head in the clouds or is hungry, and they're literally their body language. It can shut you down and affect your confidence in what you think. Also things like social media, it's like these quiet pictures of houses, like they weren't really popping off on the gram like you would think. So there's that kind of, protecting your confidence, because your confidence as an artist, and especially as I talk to older practicing photographers, they say that the fact that you want to go photograph that is the most important thing possible within your practice, because that can go away, that want to do it. So yeah, all of that wrapped up into say that's kind of, I think that there's a fine line of treading like the personal and being pulled back, and I'll finish by saying that is to the credit of editors who can kind of take a step back, because showing this work in France was really people didn't even know like what Texas was necessarily, or they're like heard of it once. It's like, and it's hard when you're making the work, all the intricate details, so you can kind of get a little bit too much in the weeds with how personal it is. So it's nice to have an editor who can help you kind of take a step back and look at it from a view that's not fully contextualized in your own experience, if that makes sense.
Okay, and in the interest of being good editors, I think we're going to wrap it up there and open
Yes.
it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Hi, everyone. So please feel free to raise a hand if you have a question, and I will run the mic over to whoever's hand I see first. Here we go.
Since you're nearby. Good afternoon, and thank you for today's presentation. I saw a long arc, which I enjoyed, and I'm a high member and a photographer.
Thank you.
I love to see all these people in the room. My question for you, Rahim, is in terms of the exhibit, A Long Arc, what was a pleasant surprise for you?
I think that it was a breaking down of certain eras that often kind of get cross-faded and kind of skewed together. So kind of seeing this like moment where we become post-war, and there feels this kind of like urge of progress that kind of patches you between the FSA and the civil rights. Like I thought that breaking down of that one wall was like very pivotal on being like, whoa, I kind of have skewed some of these moments together where these decades were so vastly different. So that was one thing that really, really stuck out to me, was kind of that clarity of like, wow, no, these were different political contexts and social contexts in which these images are made, but also the overlaps and how, in a way we are kind of like half taking from the past generation, half pushing into something new, and it's kind of like in a way like a baton race from each generation, and that was really cool to see like broken down in that context, because I think a lot of times that whole history kind of starts to get jumbled together. And I think that sometimes I think about photography in this very kind of like I don't want to say it's like hierarchical, but what's the word? I think that in a way we start to think of like, even with certain terms that is used in arts, like old masters and these things, it's like very patriarchal speech and thinking, and this person being the father of this, in the way in which that erases a lot of people out. So that's something that I try to check myself in on, and like being too easy to like simplify the history and like why this person was working or why this person was working, because they're all so vastly different and overcoming their own challenges to produce the work they did.
Any other questions? Gotcha. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both. The show is really quite special. Being someone who is, I guess you could consider maybe like a great migration baby, right? My family's from the South, but I was raised in the North. I'm curious as to how you all wrestle with the mythology of a place that is very much still real. So we can talk about the South, but it's like we're currently in Atlanta, right now. It's not like an idea, but a very real place. And so I wonder, particularly in dealing with photography, what that relationship between mythology and reality of the South kind of looks like.
Great question. Do you? I can get into that as well. I mean, I don't want to be a mic hog, but that's a really interesting question and something that is always kind of deeply on my mind as well. While working in the South, while also working within photojournalism and kind of being tasked with telling contemporary stories and difficult stories, and this like line between being sensitive of like you said, that these are real people. These are people who are still there and still very much challenging. They're not here in the museum at the moment, and they are, like I said, kind of this readily available subject matter for photography, and they are literally the fibers of what it is that this whole infrastructure is built on, and I think is also in a way mirrors the story of the American South. And so yes, very much want to acknowledge like the contemporary struggles of people. And also the ability to transcend that narrative, is also just as important. I think a lot about the writers and the critics, and I think that it's great that we're separate, that we make the work and they make the writing, And I think about someone like Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Warmth of Other Suns, which is just like I would suggest to everyone, if you're interested in the Great Migration, it's a massive book that's chronicling what was the largest migration in American history, this thing that happened over, very thick book. And also Imani Perry, who writes so lyrically, who also contributed to the book and is, someone I really admire. Her book, South to America, where she explores kind of broken down by region, these kind of contemporary and historical narratives within place, and also you're still existing relationship where you go to certain states within the South and there's only a cut of so many cities that are still deemed as safe to travel through, and how sometimes, especially in the idea of like with the kind of archetype of like the white male photographer and their ability to kind of jump from group to group in a way that's not necessarily possible for other practitioners. It's all fascinating, and I mean, even with thinking about the Great Migration in the cities where people migrated to, places like Pittsburgh, places like Detroit, places like Buffalo, New York, places like Cleveland, which is now characterized as the Rust Belt, which has its own set of tropes and its own sets of shortcomings, and it's a part of the country that I have an immense interest and respect for, but how much of that also comes from the mythology of the Walker Evans Bethlehem image, and you want to go find the steel mill yourself. It's all in there, but hey.
I don't know if this is a particularly satisfying answer, but the kind of like the question that you're asking is a big reason why Sarah and I wanted to do the show. So neither of us are native Southerners. I grew up in rural Massachusetts and spent most of my adult life in Chicago. Sarah grew up in LA, lived in DC for a while. So neither of us really spent much time in the South. Like I had hardly spent any time in the South before I moved here. So every notion that I had about the South was absorbed from music, movies, books, a lot from photography. And so in a lot of ways, this exhibition was kind of a way for us to kind of dig in to that. And I don't know that I can like really put my finger on it, but I feel like a lot of the pictures in the show and in the book are like they, kind of teach me something about what the South is and kind of like how kind of broad and diverse and kind of slippery it is to kind of try to define Southernness. I mean, if you read the essays, you look at the pictures, there's not a lot of like declarations about like, this is kind of like, well, it's this, it's also that, and it's like this and it's that, and they contradict each other, and it's like an immensely diverse and complicated region, and we're looking at, something like 170 years of image making. And so I don't have the best answer, but I feel like looking at the pictures, like you kind of get a sense for like all of these little touch points about kind of all of these things that the South is, and kind of like, the vast multitude of what it is. And that's one of the reasons why photographers make work here. That's why people who already live here are making pictures here and they're not going somewhere else. That's why people from all over the world travel here to make pictures. Is like, when photographers are trying to figure out like what is America? What is American identity? They tend to come here to try to do that and try to like work out that question, and they come to their own answers, or they come to even more questions. But it's an endlessly fascinating place, and I hope someone does this show again in 25 years, and they're like, yeah, like that jerk, he didn't know what he was talking about, and and they just like rewrite it all over again. I mean, we're kind of looking back at a show that was done 25 years ago, or 27 years ago in 1996, and kind of saying like, they got a lot of things right, but they missed a lot of things. Or, we're trying to, we're reevaluating a history of photography in this exhibition as well. So there's so much going on. There's so many questions to be asked and answered, and just puzzled over it. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to do with the show. And so thank you for going along on the ride with us.
We have time for one more.
Thank you both. Rahid, you're a very eloquent speaker, so thank you. So my question has to do with the decision-making process, if you have one, for where you shoot and what you shoot. So I was looking through your photos. I'm wondering if you are trying to capture more of the people or the place or both. And I know people are shaped by place, but also landscape shapes people. So I'm wondering if you have a sort of intention or goal with where you decide to shoot and how.
Yes, that's a great question. I often think about photographs in kind of a monographic sense, so mostly within a body of work, and kind of in the way that I conceptualize my own bodies of work, each one is almost in a way its own movie, kind of like a lot of photography and cinema have these very interesting overlaps. So how do you set the scene, You think about someone like Robbie Mueller, who did Paris, Texas, and his work with Wim Wenders, and the way that these what are known as establishing shots in cinema. So the establishing shots are so important, and the quiet moments are so important for the spectacular moments. And it's kind of in a way its own kind of concerto, where there's highs and there's lows, and I don't even know if that's what a concerto is, but but there's something there, and the kind of something that Tina Camp writes a lot about is this idea of listening to images, and that there's a hum and there's an audible reading and how they reflect upon you. So each one is its own decision, and how is that? Sometimes do you need to show? How much do you need to show? How much do you need to hold back? And so I think about them all in their own individual sense. And so, and then deciding on what it is that you're interested in. I mean, I think the best subject matters are things that are close to you. It's the things you're going to know the most about. It's the things you're going to have the most access to, and it's going to be the least trivial to overcome working on a project about. And each, different subject matters employ different tools, if it's technically or if it's conceptually. And it kind of just, the splinters from there start thinking about one place and thinking about how it's been described in the past. And I think that, that's a part of why I'm so interested in the history, because I don't want to, you always make this joke about, if you are doing something or you're making something and then you see a film or you read a book and you're like, wow, really wish I had, read this before I did that other thing. I think that, I don't want to go back where I'm, just feeling a little uncomfortable. I'm seeing something that I should have known about, or I just think that it's good to be in conversation with what's come before you and who's asked those questions before you, so that you're not erasing or out of step with something that you're working on. But yes, thank you guys so much. It's been really a pleasure to meet with you, Greg. Thank you. And
thank you.